How long do you think the shortest war in human history lasted? An hour? Half an hour? What if I told you it was even less a battle, so brief that by the time most people finished their morning tea, one nation had risen and another had fallen? Imagine a war that began with cannon fire and ended before the echoes had even faded from the harbor walls. 38 minutes, that's all it took. 38 minutes to decide the fate of a sultan, an island, and an empire that claimed to rule the world. Before we begin this astonishing story of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war ever recorded, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this journey through history, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction. It really happened, and it will make you question how far power, pride, and empire can go in the span of less than 1 hour. Now close your eyes for a second and picture this: the Indian Ocean, the year 1896. The sun has barely risen over the Sultan's palace in Zanzibar. The air smells of salt and clove, the very spice that made this island the jewel of East Africa. But beneath that soft, tropical calm, something electric is brewing. The British flag flutters from the consulate's mast, but not everyone on this island accepts its authority. The Sultan is dead, and his throne, a throne built on centuries of trade, slavery, and colonial intrigue, stands empty. The island's fate now hinges on a single question: who will sit upon it? Just a few hours earlier, on the night of August 25th, 1896, the old Sultan Hamid bin Thuwaini had drawn his final breath. To most of the islanders, it seemed like a natural death, perhaps an illness, perhaps age. But to the British, who controlled much of Zanzibar's government through advisors, the timing felt suspicious, because waiting in the shadows of the palace was Khalid bin Barghash, Hamid's ambitious cousin, a man the British had long distrusted. Khalid was young, proud, and defiant, and he wanted the throne for himself. The moment Hamid died, Khalid acted. He gathered his loyal guards, slipped into the palace under cover of night, and before dawn, he had declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar. He raised his flag above the House of Wonders, the largest building in East Africa, its iron and marble gleaming in the first light of morning. But there was one problem: the British hadn't approved it. In the age of empire, the British government did not tolerate surprises, least of all from a protectorate like Zanzibar. The island may have had a sultan, but since the Heligoland Zanzibar Treaty of 1890, it was effectively under British control. No sultan could assume power without London's approval, and the man the British supported was not Khalid, but Hamud bin Mohammed, a more pliable, Western-friendly figure. By sunrise, word of Khalid's defiance reached the British consul Basil Cave. His name suited his character: calm, sharp, and used to the dark corners of diplomacy. Cave had spent years managing delicate relations between the crown and the Zanzibari elite. But this morning his hands trembled slightly as he drafted a telegram to the Foreign Office in London. He knew exactly what this meant. If Khalid refused to step down, the British would have to act, and fast. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Khalid was preparing for a fight. He ordered the palace gates barricaded and the Sultan's guard, about 2,800 men, to arm themselves. They were poorly trained, but they had old rifles, a few cannons, and a fierce loyalty to the new Sultan. The palace courtyard echoed with the sound of boots and shouted orders. Drums beat in the distance, summoning volunteers from across Stone Town. Down at the harbor, British warships were already moving into position. The HMS St. George, the flagship under Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, anchored directly opposite the palace. Two more ships, HMS Philomel and HMS Raccoon joined her, their cannons aimed squarely at the Sultan's walls. A smaller gunboat, HMS Thrush, slipped between them, its decks lined with Royal Marines and sailors ready for action. The tension thickened as morning light grew brighter. Locals gathered in the streets, whispering in Swahili and Arabic, glancing nervously toward the palace. Merchants closed their shops. The smell of gunpowder drifted faintly in the humid air. At 8 a.m., Basil Cave sent Khalid a final warning. His message was short, formal, and cold. If you do not haul down your flag and vacate the palace by 9 a.m., we shall open fire. The words reached Khalid like a spark in dry grass. His advisors urged him to flee. They knew the might of the British Navy. But Khalid refused. Tell them, he said, his voice tight with pride, that I will not step down, and I will not lower my flag. Cave, now aboard the St. George, received the reply with grim silence. He turned to Admiral Rawson. He means to fight, Cave said. Rawson nodded, his jaw clenched. Then we shall finish it quickly. As the clock ticked closer to 9, the tension became unbearable. The palace stood shimmering in the heat, its white facade brilliant against the turquoise sea. On the shore, hundreds of Zanzibari civilians crouched behind crates and palm trees, unsure whether to run or stay. On the British ships, sailors loaded shells into 9-pounder naval guns. Marines stood ready at their posts, the sun glinting off their brass buttons. At precisely 8:55 a.m., a bugle sounded from the St. George, a final warning. Aboard the palace walls, the Zanzibari flag still fluttered defiantly in the wind. At 9 a.m., Admiral Rawson gave the order. A thunderclap ripped through the harbor as the first British shell screamed across the water and slammed into the palace's upper floors. The war, if one could call it that, had begun. The palace exploded in a bloom of fire and smoke. Its ornate balconies collapsed in a rain of shattered stone and burning wood. The Sultan's guards, terrified but loyal, fired back wildly from the courtyard, their old muskets cracking uselessly against the armored hulls of British warships. The ships answered with another salvo and another. The sound rolled over the city like a storm. Within minutes, the palace was engulfed. Flames leapt from its windows. The marble colonnades that had stood for generations began to crumble. The Sultan's personal yacht, the HHS Glasgow, tried to return fire with its small guns, but the British ships quickly turned their attention to it. A single shell hit its magazine, and the yacht burst into flames, sinking slowly into the harbor, its mast toppling into the sea like a dying torch. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Khalid's men shouted and screamed, some trying to carry the wounded, others dragging cannons into the courtyard. Khalid himself was urged to flee, but still he hesitated, his pride warring with fear. The air was thick with smoke and dust. The roar of explosions drowned out human voices. By 9:15 a.m., the palace's entire seaward facade was gone. The British Marines had landed at the docks, advancing through the smoke. They met only brief resistance. The Sultan's guards were outmatched, their courage no match for naval artillery. Khalid, finally realizing the hopelessness, escaped through a back door of the palace, escorted by a few loyal servants. They darted through narrow alleys toward the German consulate, which stood under the neutral protection of another empire. There, the Sultan of 38 minutes sought asylum. By 9:38 a.m., the guns fell silent. The palace was a ruin, its walls blackened, its towers broken. Over 500 Zanzibaris lay dead or wounded. The British had lost a single sailor, injured by falling debris. The flag of Khalid's short reign was torn and smoking, hanging in tatters over the wreckage. In less than 40 minutes, the rebellion was over. The shortest war in history had ended. The smoke from the burning palace drifted over the harbor like a shroud. Ash fell upon the water, staining it gray. The air smelled of charred wood and gunpowder, mingled with the scent of cloves from warehouses nearby. For the people of Zanzibar, the world had changed in less than an hour. Where once the Sultan's white palace had stood, now there was only a skeleton of ruin, a reminder of what defying the empire meant. At 9:40 a.m., Admiral Harry Rawson ordered the guns to cease fire. Silence followed, heavy and unreal. Sailors leaned over the rails of their ships, staring at the destruction they had unleashed. Some looked triumphant, others uneasy. For them, it had been a mission, not a battle. But for those on shore, it was the end of a world. Basil Cave, the British consul, stepped out onto the quay with his umbrella and notebook. He adjusted his collar, even in the midst of chaos. He maintained the air of a civil servant. He looked across the harbor toward the smoking ruins, then turned to a Marine officer. "Send word to the palace," he said calmly. "Tell them that the Sultan's government is no more. And prepare a guard for Hamid bin Mohammed. He will be installed immediately." It was almost absurd, the efficiency with which the British replaced one ruler with another. By noon, as the fire still smoldered, Sultan Hamid was proclaimed the new sovereign of Zanzibar. He was dressed in ceremonial robes, provided by the British themselves, standing in the shade of the very buildings that had survived the bombardment. The Union Jack fluttered above him, alongside the red flag of Zanzibar. It was less a coronation and more an announcement that the island was now firmly under the British crown's shadow. Meanwhile, Khalid bin Barghash, the man whose pride had sparked it all, crouched in the marble hall of the German consulate, drenched in sweat, his ears still ringing from the thunder of the guns. The Germans, rivals of the British, received him politely but cautiously. Consul Dr. Gustav Rabe offered him a glass of water and a seat, then sent word to the British that the former Sultan was now under German protection. Cave, upon hearing this, clenched his jaw. "He cannot remain there," he said. "The crown demands his surrender." But the Germans refused. They invoked international law, claiming their consulate was neutral ground. For the British, already satisfied with their victory, it was not worth a diplomatic crisis, and so Khalid the Sultan, who had ruled for just 38 minutes, lived on in exile within the walls of a foreign power's house, watching his kingdom burn through a narrow window. That night, as darkness fell, Zanzibar lay eerily quiet. The once proud House of Wonders was reduced to rubble. Corpses were carried away in carts. British Marines patrolled the streets, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. In the harbor, the wreck of the HHHS Glasgow still smoked, its black hull half submerged. Children whispered to one another about the fire from the sea, while old men shook their heads, murmuring that the spirits had abandoned the island. But to the British press thousands of miles away in London, it was a triumph. Newspapers printed headlines that almost mocked the brevity of the war. "Victory in 38 minutes, proclaimed the Daily Mail. A new Sultan for Zanzibar order restored by British naval force. To the public, it was another demonstration of imperial power, proof that the empire could act swiftly and decisively wherever its interests were threatened. What those papers did not print, however, were the human stories, the women searching for their husbands among the ruins, the children orphaned by the shelling, the palace servants who died trying to save the royal horses from the flames. History would remember only the number 38 minutes and forget the screams that filled those minutes. Over the following weeks, Sultan Hamid, guided closely by Basil Cave and the British advisors, began implementing reforms. One of his first acts was to abolish the slave trade, which had long been the dark heart of Zanzibar's economy. On paper, this was a noble step celebrated by London and missionaries alike. But in truth, it was also a way to break the remaining power of the Arab elite, who had profited for centuries from the slave markets of Stone Town. With the abolition came economic collapse. Plantations lost labor, trade faltered, and thousands were left in poverty. The British filled the vacuum with new policies and new officers. They built schools that taught English, reorganized the army under British command, and began reshaping Zanzibar into what they called a model protectorate. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment simmered. To many Zanzibaris, the empire's new order felt like a cage built of good intentions and hidden chains. Khalid, meanwhile, remained a thorn in the British side. For several weeks he lived under German protection, a fugitive monarch whose brief reign had made him both famous and powerless. When the British demanded his extradition, the Germans responded with characteristic precision. "Our ships will see to his departure." On October 2nd, 1896, a small German vessel slipped out of the Zanzibar harbor under the cover of darkness with Khalid aboard. He was taken to Dar es Salaam, then part of German East Africa, where he lived in quiet exile. The British protested but did nothing. For the empire, the matter was closed. The war, if one could still call it that, was over. But Khalid never forgot. In his letters written years later, he described that morning as a moment of betrayal and shame, not only for himself, but for the idea of sovereignty itself. "They call it the shortest war," he wrote, "but for me it has never ended." And perhaps he was right. Because the echoes of those 38 minutes carried far beyond Zanzibar's shores. They marked the turning point of European domination in East Africa, a symbol of how swiftly the age of empires could crush any flicker of independence. In London, diplomats saw it as a textbook example of gunboat diplomacy, a lesson that power, not persuasion, ruled the colonial world. But in Africa, whispers of the event traveled through caravan routes and port towns. The British fired once, people would say, and the Sultan vanished. It became a story told in markets and camps, a warning of what defying empire would bring. In the following years, Zanzibar transformed from a thriving trade hub into a quiet colonial outpost. British administrators replaced local ministers. Streets once filled with Arab merchants and Indian traders now bore the names of British officers. Even the royal palace, rebuilt by order of the new government, stood as a hollow replica of what had been lost. Still, history had a sense of irony. When World War I erupted in 1914, Khalid bin Barghash reappeared not as a ruler, but as a pawn in another empire's game. In German East Africa, he sided with the Germans against the British, hoping to reclaim his lost honor. For a brief time, he commanded a small force of loyalists, fighting in the dense jungles and coastal towns. But when the Germans lost the war, Khalid's fate turned again. He was captured by British forces in 1916. The same empire that had once bombarded his palace. This time there was no consulate to protect him. He was exiled first to Seychelles, then to St. Helena, the remote island where Napoleon had once been imprisoned. There, surrounded by endless sea and silence, Khalid spent his remaining years writing poetry and reflecting on the island that had once been his kingdom. He died in 1927 far from home, his name barely remembered by the empire that had defeated him in less than an hour. Back in Zanzibar, the British flag continued to fly. The island became a symbol of imperial efficiency order imposed by might, prosperity maintained by control. Yet the memory of that fiery morning lingered, passed down through generations like a legend. Old men would tell children about the day the sky burned and the Sultan's palace fell. And as time went on, that story changed, no longer a tale of defeat, but of defiance. Because even though Khalid lost, he had dared to stand against an empire that ruled a quarter of the earth. In that brief doomed stand, there was something heroic, something that spoke to every people who had ever been conquered, every voice that had ever been silenced. When Zanzibar finally gained independence in 1963, the new leaders invoked that memory. They called it a warning and an inspiration, proof that freedom, however short-lived, was worth fighting for. And so in the annals of history, the Battle of Zanzibar remained more than a curiosity. It was a perfect paradox, the shortest war that revealed the longest shadow. For 38 minutes, two worlds collided, the dying age of sultans and the unstoppable march of empire. One was erased, the other etched its name deeper into history. But the echoes of cannon fire still seemed to linger over the Indian Ocean. Faint, yet enduring like the heartbeat of a story too brief to forget. Because sometimes it only takes 38 minutes to change the course of centuries. The years that followed the Battle of Zanzibar were quiet on the surface, yet beneath that calm, history was being rewritten, not with swords or cannons, but with paper, ink, and bureaucracy. The British, ever the architects of empire, understood that conquest was not complete when the guns fell silent. It was complete when memory itself was reshaped. In the dusty archives of the Zanzibar Residency, clerks began recording new rules, new decrees, and new censuses. The names of those who had served Khalid were quietly erased from government lists. The titles of local nobles who had resisted British influence were stripped away. And in schools established by missionaries, children were taught that the war had been a necessary action, a lesson in the value of order, civilization, and obedience to the crown. But in the narrow streets of Stone Town, the story lived on in whispers. Elders told the tale differently. We remember, they said, the morning when the sky cracked open, when fire rained from the sea, and when a sultan refused to bow. Mothers told their children that courage was not measured in years or victories, but in the will to stand, even when defeat was certain. In the markets, where Indian merchants haggled over spices and cloth, the scars of the bombardment remained visible. The House of Wonders, once the grandest structure in East Africa, built with electric lights before London's Buckingham Palace, had them now stood partially rebuilt, its ornate verandas missing, its marble columns scorched. Yet people still gathered beneath it, as though the spirit of the old sultan lingered there, watching over his lost kingdom. To British officials, Zanzibar had become a symbol of efficiency, an example of how quickly and neatly the empire could assert control. Reports sent to London boasted of stability, prosperity, and modern administration, but those reports rarely mentioned the growing unease among the islanders or the quiet resentment that simmered beneath polite smiles. By the early 1900s, Zanzibar had become the empire's model colony, polished on the outside, restless within. Sultan Hamid's son, Ali bin Hamid, inherited the throne in 1902, only 16 years old. He had been educated by British tutors, dressed in European suits, and spoke English more fluently than Arabic. His reign marked the completion of what Britain had begun that morning in 1896, the transformation of an independent sultanate into a compliant protectorate. But Ali was not without doubts. In private letters to friends, he wrote of feeling like a stranger in my own court. He admired the British, but resented their control. In one passage, he confessed, "They call me Sultan, yet every order must pass through their hands before it bears my seal." The psychological legacy of the 38-minute war was perhaps its deepest wound, the quiet erosion of sovereignty that followed victory. Where once stood proud Arab rulers who commanded fleets and armies, now sat monarchs who ruled only in name, their power filtered through British advisors. Meanwhile, across the continent, Africa itself was being carved like a map of opportunity. The scramble for Africa, which had begun a decade earlier, reached its full stride. Nations like Germany, Belgium, and France seized vast territories, their boundaries drawn by European diplomats who had never set foot on the lands they divided. To many historians, Zanzibar's 38-minute war was a small footnote in that grand story, a flicker amid the storm of colonial expansion. Yet in its brevity, it revealed the nature of the entire age, the imbalance between indigenous power and industrial empire, between tradition and technology. Consider this. In those 38 minutes, more shells were fired from British ships than the entire Zanzibari army had fired in its lifetime. The empire's iron and fire had crushed centuries of history in less time than it takes to prepare a meal. And yet, even in that imbalance, there was poetry, because no empire lasts forever. By the mid-20th century, as the winds of decolonization began to sweep across Africa, Zanzibar once again found itself at a crossroads. The British Empire, weakened by 2 world wars, began retreating from the lands it had once ruled. The Indian Ocean, once dominated by British fleets, now echoed with the songs of independence movements. In 1963, Zanzibar finally gained its independence from Britain. For the first time in 67 years, the Union Jack was lowered over Stone Town, replaced by the red flag of a new nation. The ceremony was solemn, dignified, and yet beneath the formalities, old ghosts stirred. For some, independence was a long-delayed vindication. For others, it was merely the beginning of another struggle. Just 1 month later, in January 1964, the island erupted in the Zanzibar Revolution, a violent uprising that overthrew the Arab-dominated Sultanate and installed a new revolutionary government. Thousands died, and the streets once again ran red. The cycle of power, once begun with the bombardment of 1896, came full circle. The revolutionaries spoke of equality, freedom, and the end of imperial rule. But history, with its cruel irony, often repeats its own patterns. The new rulers imposed their own form of authority, and within a year, Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika to form the nation now known as Tanzania. And somewhere in that story, buried beneath the layers of revolt, politics, and time, lay the faint echo of the world's shortest war. Today, if you walk through the streets of Stone Town, you can still see traces of it. The palace ruins remain, restored but scarred. The cannonballs that struck its walls are preserved in museums. Tour guides tell the story to visitors who marveled at such destruction could happen in less than an hour. Children sell postcards with the caption, "The 38-Minute War." Most tourists smile, take pictures, and move on unaware that the soil beneath their feet once shook with cannon fire that changed the course of a nation. But to the descendants of those who lived through it, the memory is not entertainment. It is inheritance. A fisherman named Omar once told a journalist, "My great-grandfather was a palace guard. He died that morning. The British called it a battle, but we call it a warning." And perhaps that is what makes the story of Zanzibar's 38-minute war so haunting. It is not just the brevity that shocks us, but what that brevity reveals, how power can be exercised without pause, how history can be rewritten in the span of a heartbeat. It was a battle without glory, a war without heroes, yet it remains one of the clearest mirrors of an era defined by conquest and control. When the British ship sailed away that evening, leaving behind smoke and silence, they believed they had written the final word. But history never ends in the moment of victory. It lingers in the memories of the defeated, in the stories told beneath starlit skies, in the names carved quietly into graves. And so, more than a century later, the cannons of the St. George still echo across time, a reminder that even the shortest wars leave the longest shadows. For 38 minutes on an August morning in 1896, the empire flexed its might, and a sultan's dream turned to dust. But the spirit of that brief defiance, the refusal to lower the flag, endures, whispering through history's corridors that even the smallest stand can outlive the greatest empire. Because sometimes it is not the length of a war that defines it, but the courage that began it.